What's up, people? Welcome back to my channel. As usual, we'll be discussing all kinds of three-armed cultist stuff, but instead of covering the current state of the faction today, I want to take a few steps backwards and spend a moment reminiscing over previous editions of the Genestealer Cult in the last few years gone by. I know there's a lot of new converts to the cult since the start of 10th. Granted, it's a new edition, people start new armies all the time, they want to try something fresh, and there's always an influx of meta chasers when they see just how good our win rate is so far. As I mentioned elsewhere on Instagram, etc., being totally honest, I'm not enjoying playing GSC a great deal right now. It doesn't feel that fun to me. Why, you might ask? It's mainly down to the playstyle that our index sub-faction rule pushes onto us. They came from below. I just really don't like it. Not only because I find dumping hordes of neophytes or demo charge acolytes onto the board out of deep strike so bland and boring, especially for my opponent, it annoys me that you cannot get essential buffs like sustained hits or extra ballistic skill without doing it. I don't want to have to keep dipping in and out of the shadows just to be more accurate. I think my other main beef for me is the Patriarch. I really miss him. I miss the psychic phase and the bonuses that he would grant, like Might from Beyond, Mutogenic Deviation, Psychic Stimulus, Mass Hypnosis. I know a lot of this has been subversely re-implemented in other ways, but none seem to have any impact like they used to. I miss him being dangerous. I miss being able to customize him. I miss being able to run 3 of them, even if I had to leak 4 CP out of my ears before the game started in 2 extra patrol detachments just to do it. I understand this is just the index, but it's the index we're going to be stuck with for at least a year and a half, and that saddens me, which got me onto thinking of all the weird and wonderful opportunities we had to run Genestealer Cult the way we wanted, rather than being stuck in this situation where we can win quite easily, it seems, but only if we play a certain way. Sure, we could do plenty of silly stuff, but it's almost like you'd be accepting the fact it's probably not going to go down so well. You'd be going out of your way to make things harder for yourself. It takes a special kind of 40k player to do that. The lure of winning a game is typically just too much to refuse. But anyway, as usual, before we get into the beef and cheese of the matter, let's set the scene a little, because many of you probably will never understand what it meant to be a cult player a few years back. In short, we were a bit of a joke, let's be honest, between 2019 and the end of 2021. GSC came in strong with the new codex halfway through 8th edition along with its new model range, made a huge splash, and then Games Workshop went, okay, you've had your 5 minutes of fun, and then they slapped us with points increases that remained for almost 2 years. Thanks to that, we were absolute bottom of the barrel, reduced to nothing more than a meme alongside our peers at the time, which were Astra Militarum and Tau. We sucked. It was so bad that people almost stopped playing the faction outright. Like, you could look at a tournament listing for hundreds of players and you'd be lucky to see a single GSC entrant. For the most part, the Genestealer Cults experience became one of ridicule. You'd turn up to a game with this faction and you're either met with your opponent laughing at you or like bowing in respect for your determination to fight with one hand tied behind your back. It wasn't just our army was kind of overcosted for what it did, not to mention complex and unorthodox in its design. Other armies started to see massive power creep as 9th edition began, and it just doubled down on the punishment as we remained stuck with our old book, desperately trying to survive. But I think I can speak for many of us, that's why it kind of appealed. It was the underdog vibe. I started making YouTube content around March 2021, I think, and without blowing my own trumpet too hard, I think the reason it got people thinking and invested in my channel was because I advocated a playstyle that completely went against the grain. The general advice out there was just try to deep strike charge or take 9 ridge runners, all kinds of total bollocks. It was like the blind leading the blind, and I basically came in like, yo, spam Twisted Helix acolytes with saws and cutters and drills in trucks and charge the entire thing of the enemy turn 1 and tried to smash them into the ground, because it kind of worked. You just had to learn to play like how an orc would. We did get a few boosts along the way, notably the Greater Good expansion book, which gave us loads of new traits, relics and stratagems, and also an update elsewhere that made all hand flames in the game go from 6 inches to 12 inches range, and that made a huge difference to our acolyte hordes. When our 9th edition codex finally dropped in January 2022, we did not immediately become powerful, far from it. In fact, we actually got what many people would consider as the single most balanced and well-written codex in the 9th era. And that's exactly what I was hoping for. Lots of options, lots of possibilities, lots of interwoven combos and ideas that meant even after a year and a half, you probably still hadn't had chance to try out all of the potential tricks we had up our sleeve. Today, we're going to revisit the best of those, especially from the 8th era, because they were certainly slightly more bonkers. The red blip trick. I had to start with this one. I pretty much invented it. I mean, I probably didn't, but I certainly became well known as the biggest user/abuser of it. Many will still debate that it wasn't even legal, but it certainly was, unless you played in WTC tournaments, of course, because they spoil everyone's fun. The red blip trick in the 8th edition codex allowed you to take advantage of how a unique deployment method was worded. In short, when setting up your army, GSC players would just pop down these familiar cult ambush blips to represent where any unit from your roster could appear once the game started. You could change your mind as to what went where at the last minute, allowing you to adapt to your opponent's setup on the fly. The interesting part, however, was that due to rules as written, a singular entity like a character or a vehicle was not actually required to appear from the red blip within its own deployment zone. It could extend outwards. So a Goliath truck, for example, could start within an inch of that blip, fully park its full length forwards of the deployment line. A Goliath truck's like, 5 to 6 inches long? You could immediately then dump a squad of acolytes from it within 3-inch disembark range, move 6 inches, advance with a 3+ to advance buff between a Clamavus and the Twisted Helix trait, and you'd already be between 18 and 24 inches across the board before you even charge, and that's just with one squad. You could do this with as many trucks and its cargo as you wanted. It was completely unexpected and pretty fucking brutal sometimes. The best part was that after those trucks dumped their cargo, you just steamed them ahead to, rammed them into everything, and basically caused a roadblock on the enemy deployment line they'd struggle to break through. You'd tie up their tanks, get them occupied, wasting time fighting empty, cheap transports. When I said that you had to learn to fight like an orc, this was like a speed war turned up to 11. The Sanctus. He's always been a weird pick, hasn't he? But in 8th, he was a real bastard and not many people realised it. Most people never even knew half of the stuff he was capable of. I mean, here's a few classics. He had his relic sniper rifle, the Gift from Beyond, which allowed you to trigger Perils of the Warp on an enemy psyker after you knocked a wound off them. For anyone who joined in 10th and missed the fun, Perils of the Warp was basically when you tried to conjure a psychic power. If you rolled a double 1 or a double 6, your psyker's head basically backfired and frazzled, causing him mortal wounds. Even better, if that killed them, then the psychic blast became an actual area effect explosion that caught everyone else in a 6-inch radius. So this rival had a 50-50 chance of causing this to happen even just by hitting the target. So then for the second part, the Sanctus had an ability allowing him to instantly fire his rifle at the moment he was set up on the board, either from deep strike or just during deployment from the old red blip. If your opponent went first, you would have to take an entire first movement phase before you would reveal what units popped up from which red blip. At that moment, you could appear as the Sanctus and instantly fire during your opponent's turn, aiming directly at his hapless psyker, blowing their head off whilst his whole army is clumped together around them and causing loads of splash damage. My favourite moment was doing this in a knockout tournament semi-finals to an Inquisitor, who then dealt mortal wounds to all of the Imperial Knights and the Guard squads around him. I think that single sniper shot netted me 20 to 30 mortal wounds or something ridiculous. One thing that also often got overlooked was his dagger loadout, and a cheeky stratagem including the Greater Good book that gave him a guaranteed advance of up to 15 inches before being able to charge. You could literally fly from out of nowhere and stab characters in the face. Aberrants. So, okay, you think Aberrants are hard as nails now because they've got the 4+ feel no pain in 10th. I mean, they are, ridiculously so, but it's actually something we had once before. If you really wanted to super tech into Aberrants, there was a sort of ultimate combo you could do to buff them in 6 or 7 progressive layers, both offensively and defensively, to make them do ridiculous damage and maybe even stick around to tell the tale after. I mean, that was basically unheard of in Genestealer Cults. In short, you picked Bladed Cog as your cult, which gave them a 6-up invuln save as well, which was nice, and then you dump a load of CP into them. The recipe was 10 Aberrants, equipped in any which way. We used to actually be able to choose between the small power picks and the big hammers, and then also the leader got the improvised weapon, which was insanely good at the time. You also needed an Abominant with the Mark of the Clawed Omnissiah relic, which gave him a 4-up invuln and a crushing charge mortal wound ability. Then you'd need a Primus for hit buffs, +1 to hit. You'd need a Biophagus, who would inject the Aberrants with a serum to increase their attacks, toughness or strength, and an Icon Ward, who granted reroll 1s on their Feel No Pain ability. When it came to getting into combat, you would trigger a stratagem called Overthrow the Oppressors, which gave extra hits on a 6, or extra hits on a 5+ against Imperium armies, which is most in the game, or even better, 4+ against AdMech. That was also overlapped by the Abominant Sora, the Chosen One, which granted them double exploding hits on a 6, so That's 2 layers of bonus attacks, all at like strength 8, which was basically as good as it gets. I think in that demo video I did before, I got like something 93 damage out of just 6 Aberrants with hammers. The squad leader himself could get up to like 10 attacks with the improvised weapon before he even scored any bonus hits. He could single-handedly kill like an entire 10-man intercessor squad, if not more, depending on how lucky he got with like, you know, their armor saves and stuff. When it came to keeping your mutants alive, you could pop a stratagem to bump their feel no pain up to a 4+, rerolling 1s, and then don't forget they also used to reduce damage by 1 inherently as well. Mutogenic Deviation. Now this was a huge part of my melee playstyle. You know in 8th you could run acolytes in blobs of 20. Piling into engagement range could be tricky in proper horde mode like that, but it was cool. If you wanted to run them the cheat way with no drills or saws, it actually kind of made sense, as Twisted Helix made them strength 5. Back then strength 5 was like amazing. It meant you could wound anything in the game on a 5+ at worst. But here's the cool bit. Acolytes and Pure Strange used to have AP 1 on their claws, unless they rolled a 6 to wound, in which case that became AP -4. One of the best thing about the 8th edition codex was almost all of these sorts of things were triggered on standard rolls, not restricted to unmodified rolls. So when you got psychic power like Mutogenic Deviation, which added 1 to your wound roll, suddenly that meant you got double the amount of -4 AP hits that just sliced through almost any armor. Note that this also applied to the Patriarch's claws, meaning you could get twice as many of his sweet AP -6 4 damage super slaps. The rock cutter and the rock drill. I mean, I was always a drills guy, but the old cutter rules were very unique in their own right. Some of you will be like, what the fuck is Zara on about? Oh yes, my innocent 10th edition converts. One of the best things about acolytes used to be that we had 3 very different heavy mining weapons to choose from. And it's an absolute crime that Games Workshop just went, fuck it, consolidate them all into one generic boring melee profile. I mean, the saw was always generic, but that's not the point. The drill was pretty spicy in 9th, especially due to its auto wound feature. You didn't have to wound, it just did. It's so refreshingly useful with a wave of transhuman physiology type rules that began to overtake the meta, not allowing you to wound entire armies on like a roll of a 2 or 3. Well, unless of course we just always wound. And you could slap the opportunity to do loads of mortals on top of that. It was very flexible, allowing you to take on all kinds of targets from heavy infantry to knights to horde. But anyway, you know how loads of characters had that annoying wound cap, like the Catan Nightbringer, where you could only inflict a max of 4 wounds per phase, and any thereafter that was wasted? Well, not with the cutters in 8th. After you inflicted some damage, you then got the chance to roll a dice, and if it was higher than the amount of wounds your target had left, it just outright slayed them. No ifs or buts, no feel no pains, wound caps, nothing. Slain dead with no excuses. This was so good against those sorts of characters, and I famously did it several times against opponents who thought that their Nightbringers or Gascol Thrackers would smash me and be safe from any kind of retaliation for at least another full turn or more. Mental Onslaught. This psychic power was the true king of unrestricted combos before it got FAQ'd sometime in 8th. Basically, your Psyker would target an enemy unit, and both you and your opponent would perform a roll-off, adding the result of the dice to each of your leaderships. Now, the Patriarch had a pretty high leadership of 10, so you'd be getting 10 plus whatever your dice roll was for a max of 16, versus whatever your opponent got plus their leadership. If you won that roll-off, they would suffer a mortal wound, and then you'd go again and again and again until either you failed the roll-off or your opponent's unit died. It was great fun, like a little mini-game within the Psychic phase. Now, the early incarnation of this offensive cast did not have a stipulation by which a roll of 1 would always fail for you. They brought that in after realizing a certain issue, that we had loads of opportunities to both buff our leadership and debuff the enemies. I remember correctly, the Clamoverse buffed it, there was a relic called the Vial of the Grandsized Blood that buffed it, but then also we could subtract from the enemy using a stratagem called Monstrous Biohorrors. The Locust had an aura to do it, or we can even borrow from the Tyranids or the Astra Militarum. They had psychic powers such as Terrifying Visions or the Horror. Or best of all, you could do all of it at the same time. In short, if you created a situation where your opponent's unit could not physically beat your roll because of the starting leadership values, then they just automatically died, which was fucking hilarious, especially if your opponent has something massive on the table like a knight. If you set up the combo right and cast the power okay, it was like, okay, all 30 wounds of your knight are gone, no chance to stop it, which brings me on to yet another classic psychic power. Mind control. Mind control used to be actually that, mind control, the ability to take over your opponent's model, turn it around and use all of its guns for your own. So in the case of, say, a knight, that's the ability to borrow up to 500 points or so worth of firepower every turn you manage to cast the spell. In that semi-finals game I mentioned before, this was how I made it even more horrific for my opponent. It was like adding insult to injury and then more injury just to make sure. Put it this way, Genestealer Cults' own shooting was famously bad, so we just borrowed everyone else's guns for free. This was the kind of sneaky shit that I felt was so thematic and unique, and it made up for our own total lack of defense and offense. The Hive Mind and Brood Brothers. Just before I talked about using both Tyranid and Astra Militarum Psychers, and you probably thought, what? You can't do that? Well, we could, all the way through 8th and half of 9th. In fact, Hive Mind lists, as they came to be known, actually became the de facto most powerful way to run Genestealer Cults. It gave us a fighting chance as the meta descended from unfair to just downright silly. The chance to pick the best stuff from all three codexes and blend them together in some kind of bizarre triple soup. The Tyranid elements even got to keep the Hive fleet merits like Kraken or Kronos, and the Brood Brothers restrictions were much more simple, just no named characters, so they meant we could create loads of funky shit like mutated Ogrin, Bulgrin, Rattlings, Commissars, Psychers, Crusaders, Scion Stormtroopers, and of course the option to nick Vulture gunships and all kinds of aircraft. It was the good old days. If you want to know how this made any sense at all, here's how I ended up running it for serious matchups. My Genestealer Cults detachment was basically just a Patriarch and maybe 800 or 900 points worth of Acolyte assault troops packed into trucks. That was like my punch, my bread and butter. That's how I kicked off my game, launching them into the enemy front lines turn 1. Then my Tyranid patrol was my firepower. Typically 2 full squads of Hive Guard, or maybe up to 3, so that's 18 of them, parked on the back line with indirect fire weapons, led by a Neurothrope to give exploding hit buffs, and 1 squad of which could fire twice for 2 CP. So that's a max of 48 shots, ignoring cover, hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s with some exploding 6s, very high strength of 8 and plenty of AP, damage D3. It would smash anything. As long as the Acolytes and trucks kept the enemy pinned back, these would be slugging away all game with nothing to stop them. Lastly, my Brood Brothers patrol would be my defense, my backliners, like my objective bullies, a big squad of 9 Bulgrim backed up by a Primaris Psyker who would cast Psychic Barrier on them, giving them a 3+ invuln. They would then hold a critical flag or the midboard and just soak up bullets like a huge shield wall that refused to die. If you think that running GSC is complicated now, then you have no idea compared to running 3 separate factions at once in the same army list. Unquestioning Loyalty. Now, a lot of old GSCers used to say I was talking shit when it came to my love of this rule, but I think to be fair, they didn't really run the army the way I did, and therefore didn't see the true potential of it. It's still around in 10th, albeit now it's a stratagem you have to pay for, and it's considerably weaker and kind of pointless in many situations, since leaders are embedded in units anyway. Sure, it can save you from sniper rifles, but that's about it. The old version 8th just stipulated you could tow in a single neophyte within 3 inches of your Patriarch, for example, and the entire squad could just dive over from the opposite end of the group to take bullets for him. And best of all, it was per shot, not per wound lost. So as I would famously say, you could be slapped by the sword of the Emperor himself with damage 100, and all of that will be absorbed into the face of a single hapless goon. It didn't spill over. As long as you had loads of them around to tank the wounds for you, the Patriarch basically had his invulnerable save of 5, and then a better invuln save equivalent of 4+ hidden in his back pocket. It could save your bacon in some very nasty scraps, and turn situations around that your opponent thought would be an easy kill. The Patriarch. I guess we should talk about him in general and my undying love for him as a customizable character, because it's what I miss so dearly. Both 8th and 9th gave us so many options to turn him into a unique warlord and implement him into our game plan. Twisted Helix always took the win in my eyes, of course, allowing us to pump up his damage with Bioalchemist on top of relics like Amulet of the Voidrim to make him immune to Overwatch, and also grant a once per game ability to just say, that damage doesn't apply. I mean, did you know that Overwatch wasn't even a stratagem in 8th? It was a step every unit could do for free every time they got charged. The charge phase was an entire long-winded process of rushing and getting sprayed at constantly. The ability to ignore it was a godsend. There was also multiple options for overlaying bonus attacks, toughness, strength, such as Biomorph Adaptation and the Elixir of the Prime Specimen, and not to mention Hive Cult's unique ability to give him invuln ignoring Rending Claws, making him an excellent assassination tool for those sorts of enemy characters who relied on ridiculous impenetrable armor. Then there was the probably not very competitive but hilarious Pauper Prince's automatic loyalty test build, which meant it was literally impossible to kill the Patriarch whilst he had meat shields around him. He didn't have to roll for Unquestioning Loyalty, he just auto-passed it. So your opponent will go, alright, I'll just wipe out all the neophyte bodyguards first. But then they would realise you had another upgrade on him, which meant every time you killed a bodyguard, they also fired on death. So that's low quality return fire, but still, you were just shooting back as you got fired at in their turn. So many people shout on the Patriarch, dubbing him as uncompetitive, poor value for points cost, but I think they really failed to appreciate him for what he was. You had to be aggressive with him, and most importantly, not afraid to lose him. Like a missile you could just throw out and accept that he will die, but do some nasty work in the process. Even better, you could run 3 of them, all juiced up with bonus relics and various traits, thanks to stratagems like Broodcoven. Just be silly, you know what I mean? I hate the mindset where people choose a faction like GSC, but then take the most boring and generic list ideas. This is the wacky faction, so be wacky. The Brood Brothers drop. Now, before our Handflamers got the benefit of a 12-inch range upgrade from 6, the notorious Handflamer bomb was kind of restricted. Would have to spend 2 CP just to deep strike our acolytes into extreme close range with lying in wait, and even then it was lacking the punch of like the newer versions which had inescapable decay with the extra AP. Then there was the exposed keyword in 9th that gave us +1 to wound, but still we did it because we could. We thought it was amazing at the time, no one else could do anything like it. But there was actually a cheaper way, one which required no CP investment, and it was actually way more funky. In the 8th edition codex, Brood Brothers infantry squads were actually a part of our army rather than just borrowed from the Astra Militarum book. They were 20-man squads who really felt like an afterthought, not being able to benefit from your cult creed or any of the buffs or synergies, so a bit redundant compared to the neophytes who were identical and the same cost, but with more upgrades and stuff. But they did get cult ambush, and up until a certain FAQ, bringing an allied detachment of guard so you could access an officer like say a company commander or even a deep striking Tempesta Prime would allow you to cross-reference their order system between codexes. So what we basically got was our very own unique deep strikeable 20-man infantry squads. Guard couldn't do that, they were restricted to 10-man squads and certainly couldn't deep strike them. So you could dump in like 120 men with 4 last gunshots each for a small price of like less than 750 points, which was mental. You could just drop them in and basically do the same job as the acolytes. You know what else you could do? You could deep strike in and then issue them the move order, which meant you got another move and then you would just use that to move on to an objective or something. It's crazy. But yeah, we're going to leave it there for today because I feel like we've only just scratched the surface and most of it was 8th edition stuff. There was still loads of funky shenanigans in the 9th book, which I really do look back on fondly, even though it was only like, less than 3 months ago. But let's hope that our 10th edition codex is as balanced as its predecessor for both our sake and our opponents, because right now it does not feel great to me. Stay tuned and maybe I'll have more content coming your way sometime in the next decade, maybe? Okay, anyway, thanks for listening, guys.